World Art and Culture, Lesson 4, Part 1, The Ancient Aegean. In this part of Lesson 4, we will look at the early civilizations of ancient Greece, beginning around 3000 BC, the so-called Cycladic civilization of the islands southwest, or the southern Aegean, then the Minoan civilization down at the island of Crete, followed by the first mainland civilization in Mycenae. These are the first Greek cultures before the so-called Dark Ages, which will begin around maybe 1200 BC and last for 300-400 years. We will discuss those post-disaster, post-Dark Age developments later on. Now let's look at the Cycladic civilization. We don't have much of this civilization. Perhaps this is the first Neolithic culture of the Greeks. We have some pottery, we have some ceramics, and we have some figurative art, some small figures. The pottery, typical of Cycladic culture, is very, very aesthetically well refined, usually depicting nature, the sea life, which was obviously important. Cycladic pottery, it's known for its, let's call it its synthesis between shape and image, as we see here. There are many examples of this in Cycladic culture. We have no writing, we have no records other than these archaeological artifacts. Other than this, we have figures, the famous Cycladic figures, like these here. Now these are probably fertility symbols, fertility goddesses, as we saw earlier in the European context of the Neolithic world. But here, of course, they are much more refined, much more perhaps even androgynous, perhaps. Again, we have no record or any evidence of what their purpose or function might have been, but they must have been connected to some kind of cult of femininity or fertility. Some have speculated that these are probably, not probably, but perhaps kind of a hybrid fertility symbol, both male and female. They are very consistent. The arms underneath the breasts, the very defined triangular area, breasts, but of course we don't have the exaggerated dimensions that we saw in European Neolithic fertility goddesses early on. These are much more stylized, and we might even call them aesthetically refined. They seem to have a large nose feature, perhaps as some have suggested, perhaps it's a beak, a bird symbol, which we would connect to the spiritual symbolism we saw in birds in the both Paleolithic and Neolithic period in other parts of Europe. Anyway, these are the predominant examples of representations in the Cycladic world, these fertility figures. There are theories that they might have been used for cooking, to magically fertilize the cooking activity that these people would have done. We don't think they were used for the same rituals that the European Neolithic fertility figures were used. As you remember, those were they had no feet, so we hypothesized that they were placed in the ground to fertilize the ground. These seem to be perhaps maybe used as amulets, perhaps they were placed in graves, perhaps they were again used for cooking, somehow to fertilize cooking. This probably points to a much more Neolithic culture here in the Cycladic world, as opposed to maybe a culture defined by the constituents of civilization that we defined before. Again, perhaps this sort of aesthetic refinement we see in these figures, the almost abstract nature of their mode of representation, is a hint, an early hint in Greek history of the aesthetic dimension that the Greeks will, as we'll see, certainly be involved with. The idea of beauty, not simply as something valuable or expensive, but something perhaps closer to what we, in the modern sense, view as beauty, something aesthetically pleasing. But as we'll see, the Greeks are not just interested in visual, call it visual taste, but will connect aesthetics or the category of beauty with a notion of the design of God, of religious consciousness, of love, and ultimately of a kind of metaphysical function of beauty. So these are the Cycladic islands, and these are the first. This is the first Greek civilization. A few other things we might say about Greece to begin with. The geography of Greece, very different from other civilized areas we've covered so far. It's relatively difficult to farm. Only a few areas are for farming. There's a lot of herding of animals, goats and sheep. It's very mountainous, and this might be connected, as we look at another of these Cycladic figures, to the general Greek independence of the Greek city-states later on. The Greek area, the Greek continent, let's call it, or peninsula, is full of cities that have an identity quite their own. This will be a constant dimension of Greek cultural and political life, the independence of each state, and perhaps this informs the development of the Greek system of political organization, of course, democracy. Now, the Cycladic culture that we've been looking at, again, dates perhaps from maybe 4,000. We might say the Neolithic era of Greece begins around 4,000. We're not sure who the Greeks were, whether they came from the north, from the so-called Indo-European area, or whether they might have migrated perhaps from closer areas, from Asia Minor, from Italy. The Greeks will be, as we will see, a new civilization with unique contributions and unprecedented contributions to the history of civilization. Now, the next civilization, and we'll say the Cycladic world, begins around 4,000 BC. But around, let's say, 2000 BC, a new culture, a new civilization will emerge south of the Cycladic islands on the larger island of Crete. This will be known as the Minoan civilization. The Minoan civilization, named after the ancient or mythological King Minos, who the archaeologists who first found this site in the 19th century believed that they had discovered. Thus they gave it the appellation of Minoan. This is the palace complex at Crete, at the city of Knossos, the most famous of the sites of this period, the so-called Minoan period. Again, from around 2100 BC, 2000 BC. This is a seemingly unfortified palace complex. It has walls, but not necessarily fortified walls. It's quite labyrinthine, hence the relationship to the myth of King Minos and the labyrinth of the Minotaur. It contains various buildings, perhaps a palace, a couple of palaces, perhaps for a king, although we have no writing from this culture. The architecture is unusual. It's quite colorful, as you can see, and it also has a unique inverted column motif, where the columns are thicker on top rather than at the bottom. In general, we see a lot of colorful architecture, colorful wall paintings, as we will see. Very beautiful pottery, continuing perhaps this aesthetic dimension that we think the Greeks might have very early on been interested in. Again, this would be about 2000 BC. Now, the people of Knossos, their religion, we're not sure what it was. We assumed that these were polytheistic people. They seem to have worshipped perhaps a bull god, because there are various bull motifs at Knossos. But we also have some perhaps goddess figures, as we'll see in a second. And in general, we might say, similarly to Egypt, this early Greek culture, at least here in Knossos, seems to have a strong feminine dimension. And we saw the strong feminine dimension in the Cyclades, with the perhaps feminine or even hybrid male-female fertility figures. This is one of the reconstructed images from the palaces at Knossos, and you can see, aesthetically speaking, bright, colorful depictions, perhaps of youths, perhaps of leaders. There are also many depictions of animals, sea creatures, mythological animals, hybrid animals. Generally speaking, a very colorful and very, let's call it aesthetically pleasing form of wall decorations. The people of Knossos lived in houses, and as we mentioned, palaces. Their worship spaces seem to have been perhaps in the houses themselves or in the palace. We don't have any. There haven't been any temples found or any kind of actual centers. We might remind ourselves, though, that in Egypt there were complexes or precincts that were designed in a labyrinthine type configuration. The palace complex here at Knossos might be the center of this culture itself, housing the palace complex, the worship spaces, in this case inside the palaces, and various other important buildings. There have been findings of a very beautiful and well-crafted pottery that was probably used for food storage in the same area, and as we said, magnificent buildings and a palace complex, all of them beautifully, the ones that have been discovered, beautifully decorated, as we see here. We might say that these also express that very early at this time, Greek interest in the figure. We'll talk about the mode of representation of the Greeks later on. This is here one of these perhaps throne rooms or sanctuaries, where perhaps the king or the leader of this culture either held court, or a combination of priest-king perhaps presided over some kind of religious rites. This is usually called the throne room in one of the palaces of Knossos. And again, it's domestic sanctuary in that it's inside the actual house or palace. We're not sure what the religious makeup of this culture is. We won't have evidence of Greek religion as such for a while, at least until after the so-called Dark Ages. Here are some examples of the famous giant ceramic pots from Knossos. The Greeks will eventually create a very complex technology of ceramic and other types of vessels, not just for storage of food, but as we will see, for their religious ceremonies. The Greeks will involve sacred libations or sacred pourings in most, if not all, of their religious rituals. Pottery and ceramics will be a key format of Greek art. So perhaps let's begin to speculate on exactly what were the roots of Greek religion here at, perhaps seen here at Knossos, and maybe earlier in the Cycladic world. The Greeks, as we will know later, had an unusual religious mindset in a couple of ways. First of all, religion for the Greeks will, as we'll see, will be a communal experience. It will involve not just priests and kings, but in an unusually high or unusual sense, women and children will be involved. As we look at another image from Knossos, Greek religion is communal, will be communal by nature. Whatever these early religious habits were, we're not really sure, but we are pretty sure that sacrifice was a main part of the religious life, the main ritual, the main rite. Sacrifice, as we know, is as probably as old as the human religious consciousness, as it emerged during perhaps the early period of human worship. Sacrifice had already become a key notion, perhaps born out of the violence, as we saw in the Paleolithic world. So sacrifice will also be a part of the Greek religious life. It will be the center of their religious rituals, and as we will see, it will be also influenced by their aesthetic consciousness. The ritual of sacrifice for the Greeks will be not just meticulous as any ritual by definition is, but will also be quite beautifully, aesthetically articulated. Here at Knossos, we see perhaps a connection to, as we said, to some kind of bull worship. There are bull motifs, bull symbols like this one here. Bulls, as we have already studied, are connected to the notion of kingship that maybe goes back to, again, Paleolithic times, male virility, male strength, hunting, etc. The interesting thing about its appearance here in the Greek context of Knossos and Crete within Minoan civilization is that it's not exclusive. We have also other religious symbols or perhaps religious concepts that are in Knossos alongside with the bull. We have some goddesses or priestesses perhaps, as well as the notion of the bull perhaps as connected to some ritual of initiation of manhood, as in the famous bull fresco here from Knossos, where youths, perhaps boys, perhaps young girls, perhaps both, are shown in some kind of ritualistic bull taming or bull fighting. Perhaps this was an initiation that had its roots in some primordial cult of animals from pre-Neolithic times. We're not really sure. The bull is a prominent feature of, as we said, male kingship. We saw it in Egypt, and it certainly is prevalent here in Knossos. But again, it's not exclusive. It's not exclusively connected to kingship as we saw perhaps in Egypt, and before that in some Paleolithic representations. And of course there are these female figures, a couple of these snake goddesses or snake priestesses. We're not sure what these figures represent. Some have speculated these are early manifestations of maybe the goddess Athena. Perhaps they are a priestess in some kind of ecstatic, intoxicated state. She's shown with her snakes there, and of course a feline headdress and some kind of possessive-like look. And the breasts, of course, probably relate to some kind of fertility or sexual symbolism or function. Again, notice the aesthetically refined character of these Greek figures. They are much more, again, refined. It's aesthetically refined than we have ever seen, really. We haven't seen this kind of naturalism really since perhaps the cave paintings at Lascaux. We might, from all this, then say that Greek religion has a different character than just a purely patriarchal religion. And we will see that in terms of the Greek pantheon, female deities, female goddesses will play a prominent role, as they did in Egypt. But to continue with our discussion of Greek religion in general, the Greeks performed sacrifices, and we might remember what a sacrifice is. A sacrifice is a gift, some kind of gift for the gods, which is reciprocal, and it requires something in return. We'll be talking about that later also. So we're going to leave now the world of Crete and look at our third early Greek civilization, now on the mainland, Mycenae. Here's a reconstruction of the citadel, or the precinct at Mycenae, and we can see a few things here that are significant. First of all, it's a fortified precinct with not just distinct walls of territorial demarcation, but actual military fortifications with walls that are with passages for troops to move by, with distinct places for defense. So what we conclude from this is Mycenae was obviously a military culture. It has been suggested, again, in a kind of quasi-mythical way, that perhaps this was the land of the ancient Greeks of Homeric times, who fought against the ancient city of Troy. But again, that's mostly sort of 19th century archaeological wishful thinking. We have no record of anything like that. There is some writing from Mycenae. The first Greek comes from this civilization. Two types of Greek have been found. One that we do understand has a connection to classical Greek. Mycenae, again, will be known for its military, significantly military configuration, and it seems that it was involved in also perhaps the first evidence of the Greek notion of military hero worship, which will be a key part of the mythology of Greece, as we understand the hero in the Greek sense is something that the Greeks invented. A hero is technically a kind of superhuman human whose deeds and accomplishments give him the status of a hero. The etymology of the word hero is not very clear, but it's a new concept. It's a new concept, and we see it here certainly in Mycenae for the first time as part of their burial practices. The first heroes of Greek history are buried here at Mycenae, or at least the first evidence of such thing. Now again, a hero is not simply a human, but a kind of a divine human. Technically a human, but somebody who was able to accomplish sort of superhuman, semi-divine deeds. A hero is important to understand in the context of the Greeks' idea of life itself. The hero is an example of the Greeks' interest in life itself. Again, in contrast to Egypt, whose obsession with death, the Greeks are much more connected to life. The Greeks don't really have any consistent viewpoint of the afterlife or of any kind of life after death. They do conceive of the idea of souls, that their idea of souls is so-called psyche, or psyche as it's later going to be transliterate it, but nothing like the elaborate notion of death that the Egyptians had, as we look at one of the entrance to the Mycenaean complex. These tombs that were found at Mycenae, these tholos tombs, above ground tombs for heroes, are significant for a few reasons. First of all, they tell us what the Greeks wanted to make memorial or make into a monument, to memorialize. And that is their heroes, their military heroes. Those are the ones that were buried here, and they're buried with their military attributes, their weapons, their armor, and so forth. These are not tombs that are portals to the afterlife like the Egyptian tombs. These are not places where the dead will somehow be given material for their next life. These are simply, if we can say simply, monuments, memorials. And the memorial, again, is for the deeds of the hero, his deeds in life. Life will be a key obsession for the Greeks. Not just life itself, but the notion of human life and what that entails, and their subsequent questioning of various topics that will be unprecedented are in many ways connected to their questioning or their inquisitive contemplation of what is the meaning of life, as opposed to, remember, the Egyptian consciousness is focused in every way that we studied on the continuation of life in death. But for the Greeks, beginning here at Mycenae, the issue is life. These tombs would be filled, or would have included in their burial area these the beehive tombs, again above ground and covered with mounds of earth, would include the evidence of the deeds of the heroes in life. So we'll say the Mycenaean world, perhaps maybe 2000 to 1600 BC to the date of somewhere around 1200 BC, which is the cutoff date for Mycenae and perhaps for the Mediterranean world, at least the Greek world. For quite a while, this date 1200 has been hypothesized as the date of a great natural disaster, perhaps an earthquake, perhaps combination earthquake, volcanic eruption, earthquake, and perhaps a tsunami, as we look at some of these objects from the Mycenaean hero tombs. 1200 was some kind of catastrophe. The basic archaeological and cultural record is wiped out in that area for about 300-400 years. This is known as the Dark Ages in the Greek history, and it perhaps coincides, or it does coincide with similar gaps in the archaeological record in other parts of the Mediterranean. Perhaps this catastrophe, whatever it was, which maybe culminated in some kind of flood or deluge, is the root of the biblical and Mesopotamian stories of the Great Flood. And with this disaster will come the end of these early civilizations, and we will have to wait until about the 9th to 8th century to then see a new Greek world, which will eventually be the classical Greek world, emerge on the mainland north of Mycenae, around the city of Athens. This is another object from one of the graves at Mycenae, a beautifully crafted dagger. Again, notice the refined aesthetic character and detail, and again we We want to remember these are objects that were placed in the tomb as memorial monuments to celebrate and monumentalize. And monument, remember, comes from the same root as the word memory. A monument is something that keeps and preserves the memory. For the Greeks, monuments, and in this case it's these tombs here in Mycenae, are preservations not of bodies for the afterlife, not of the physical body for the next life, but a preservation of memory, of the memory of the heroes, of these unique new type of human characters that the Greeks invented, who have accomplished almost superhuman deeds in life. Now we know that something like a hero existed in places other than Greece, but it doesn't have the kind of importance that it does here in Mycenae, and of course later on in classical Greece. And again, this points to this Greek interest in the celebration and the monumentalization of life itself. And it also has to do with a very important key notion in Greek culture later on, which is just a notion of remembering, of memory, of what the Greeks will later call mimesis, which is connected not just to the representation or the retelling of the past, again as literally a reminder, but also a way of preserving the memories of the past. But it's also mimesis, as the Greeks will call it, of course, is a way of retelling of the past. It's connected to the notion of history that the Greeks, as history as we know it, will invent later on, and it will be a key notion in their mode of representation, or let's say their consciousness about the role of representation later on. Representation for the Greeks is in a way always connected to a kind of memorial, or remembrance, a memory, a retelling, an imitation of the past, not simply in terms of again preserving, simply to preserve, but to speculate upon, to think about, to contemplate, to maybe learn from it. The past is something you learn from. The past teaches. History teaches you. Teaches you about the choices of individuals in their lives and in the past. The memorial for the Greeks is not simply an idea. It's sort of a key notion in their way of thinking. Memory, of course, is part of time, and it's a kind of you can even say a thwarting of time, of a kind of a fighting against time. A kind of a tragic idea for the Greeks is that time is of course a reminder of death and of the final mortality that is going to be part of it's going to be the culmination of every human life. As we will see later, mortality, and again we only need to compare it to the Egyptians to see the contrast. Mortality is kind of the key to understanding the human condition. And in negative terms, or in opposite terms, immortality is sort of the main category for the gods, for the divine beings who are infinite. But humans, on the other hand, are finite. And again, in contrast to the Egyptians, this is has very deep significance for understanding the Greek mind.